Good evening. I'm Penny McPhee, the president of the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. This place is very important to Arthur Blank and his family, and we're excited to join with you all this evening for the Blank Foundation Speaker Series. Mr. Blank is here with us tonight, and Arthur, we appreciate your making this kind of event possible for the foundation and for the community. Thank you. We're grateful to the Annie E. Casey Foundation for sponsoring this program with us tonight, and to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. We admire the work that Casey does nationally, and we're especially appreciative of all that you all do here in the city of Atlanta. I also want to acknowledge the work of the Perception Institute. The Perception Institute is a nonprofit organization that's using the latest mind and brain science research to reduce discrimination associated with race, gender, and other identity differences. After tonight's program, we know that many of you will want to know how to continue this conversation, and hopefully what action you can take. So the Perception Institute can help you do both of those things. We encourage you to go to perception.org, and the contact information is in your program, and there you can sign up for the latest updates, learn how you can contribute your own ideas, and how you can participate in the Perception Institute 2020 blog. In just a moment, you'll hear from John Powell, the Executive Director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society at Cal-Berkeley. And later, from Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who many of you know as the President Emerita of Spelman College. Please see their impressive bios in your program. I'm not going to go through all of the detail, but I think we've given you the highlights in your program. And when you read that, you'll realize that we've really put together the perfect team tonight to talk about a complex and complicated issue. I recently read a quote from John Powell that seems especially apropos to tonight's discussion. Race, he said, is a little bit like gravity, experienced by all, understood by the few. What he goes on to say is that issues of race that affect all of us largely play out through our unconscious minds. And as we learn more about brain science, we can have a different kind of conversation about race than we've been able to have in the past. Which explains the title for tonight's program, Is Perception Reality? Understanding Breakthrough Mind Science Research on Racial and Other Bias. We've invited John and Beverly to share their expertise on issues such as implicit bias, stereotype threat, and racial anxiety. We're in a building tonight that's done a masterful job of curating and preserving and telling the story of some of the most dramatic moments of racial violence in our history. Troopers beating John Lewis at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. What's harder to grasp is what happens between the synapses of our brains, faster than a lightning flash when we see a face or an image or hear a name. To borrow language from the Perception Institute, our brains try hard to get it right, our hearts strive to be good, we really want to do the right thing, and yet the brain may trigger impulses that left unchecked, lead to discriminatory acts. It's these impulses that explain the results of a 2015 survey showing that girls outperform boys on math tests. if the math tests are graded anonymously. But among the same group of students, boys score higher when their names are on the tests. Some of you may have read that there is a stadium going up downtown, new stadium. With the development of the stadium, as many of you know, we are also investing in the residents of those historic West Side neighborhoods. Our immersion in Vine City and English Avenue has really confirmed how perception can limit opportunities for a whole place, for a whole group of people across many generations. To give residents the kind of choices and opportunities they deserve, we know we have to address some of these long-standing perceptions that hold the status quo in place like glue. Have any of you ever watched the reality show The Voice? Yeah? Well, so if you have, you've seen one creative way that they overcome the tricks that our brains play on us. In The Voice, when the contestants take the stage, hoping to sing their way to stardom, the judges' chairs are facing in the opposite direction. Quite literally, a blind audition, exactly the kind of blind audition symphony orchestras have used for a long time to test aspiring musicians. It forces us to listen to the music instead of relying on the impulses from our brain based on what we're seeing. If unconscious bias is a problem with music auditions, imagine the unintended harm our brains are causing in math class, on the playground, in job interviews, during a loan application process, and during encounters with law enforcement. That's why we're here tonight, to learn what we can do to overcome these nefarious brain impulses, to learn what our institutions must do to expand opportunity, ultimately to give every child something closer to a blind audition in life. So now it's my pleasure to turn over the podium to John Powell. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Frank Fernandez, who invited me here. Thank Mr. Blank for supporting this effort. Thank you all for coming out tonight and for the work that you do and that you will do. So I'm going to be talking to you about the mind science. And it's interesting. Some of it's intuitive, some of it's not intuitive. But it actually affects us in some powerful ways. So hopefully we can begin to understand how it affects us and what we might do to make sure that our unconscious mind cooperates more with our conscious mind. And oftentimes we do things we don't intend to do. We all have bias. I've said many times that I don't like the word bias because bias has a bad name. Prejudice has a bad name. Stereotype has a bad name. In reality, that's what the unconscious mind does. So it's not something that just bad people do. It's the way the unconscious mind works. And sometimes when I'm talking to groups and people say, well, you know, you're some egghead from Berkeley. You don't know me. How can you say I have biases? How can you say I have prejudice and stereotypes? And you're right, I don't know you. But that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is, neither do you. So hopefully we can introduce you to parts of yourself that you may not know as well. Now, there's something going on in the world today, and it's not just happening in the United States, it's happening all over the world. And as some people have said, the issue of othering is the problem of the 21st century. So we're going to be talking about race, but not just race. There are many different ways in which we categorize to say people are different than us. And at the extreme, when we say people are different than us, we also say unconsciously they're not fully human. And it can be around race, it can be around disability, it can be around immigration, it can be around religion. We have all these ways in which we say that person is not like me, that person is less than. These problems have shown up in some interesting places already. There are two books that talk about this, and I'm going to say just something briefly about one. One is the one on the left, my left at least, is Samuel Huntington, and he writes a book titled, Who Are We? And Huntington is talking about the American psyche, the American soul. Who are we? And Huntington goes on to say, first of all, let's stop saying we're an immigrant country. We're not an immigrant country. He says we're a settler country. The country was settled by two groups of people, Anglos and Saxons. If you're not Anglo or Saxon, according to Huntington, you're a guest in this country. And they spoke English. They were Christians, but not just Christians. They were Protestants. And Huntington goes on. He teaches at Harvard, and he's quite influential. And he says, they set the template for this country. And everyone else who comes afterwards come as a guest. They don't get to change the furniture. You know how you have guests at your house? You have a seat, but don't change the seat. Now, he skips over Native Americans. I don't know what he does with that. But what Huntington says is that the soul of America is up for grabs, and there are people who are trying to change the furniture. They're trying to change who we are. And he's saying we should feel comfortable in telling those people they do not belong. This is not their country. So when people talk about taking back their country, they're dealing with this deep psychic anxiety about losing who they are based on this imagined past. Now, Jeff Chan, who's a friend of mine, and Alexis, he's actually looking at the same changes in the country, the same changes in demographics. But instead of looking at the imagined past, he looks to an imagined future. And he wrote a book called Who We Be. And he says that, yes, we are a complex country and we're changing very fast. And change is not easy. And it's not just change in our neighborhood. It's not just change in who gets the job. It's changing who we are. And we sometimes forget when we go through major realignment, which we're going through now, we also go through profound identity change. And we need help. But Jeff Chang says this change can be a wonderful thing, but we need to embrace it. So the diversity that we all see happening around the country is, as they say, is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a thing. It's happening, and we can do very little to stop it. Walls won't stop it. Changing immigration policies won't stop it. Keeping neighborhoods won't stop it. It's happening. As you know, the majority of kids entering kindergarten today are non-white. And these kids will grow up. The change is happening. Now, this diversity begets anxiety. And there are a number of studies to show the more diverse we become, the more anxious, especially at an unconscious level, we become. And it's not just conservatives, it's actually the whole country is becoming more conservative. And some of these studies show that even when people who like diversity consciously, unconsciously, they're struggling with it. And if we don't deal with the anxiety well, it turns into fear. And I think what we're seeing play out in the country today is people having fear, not again just based on jobs or based on the economy, but based on who we are. And again, I think that we need to sort of step into this space and help us move forward. Now I'm going to do a couple of mind science tricks just to show you the complexity of the unconscious mind. So you see a cylinder and checkerboard square, and do you see an A and B square? How many of you see A and B as the same color? Okay. How many of you see the letters? Yes, the letters. All right. How many of you see A as darker? How many of you see B as darker? How many of you don't care? Well, it turns out they're the same. But most people don't see them the same because the mind adjusts and you see what you expect to see. They're exactly the same, but they look different because there's a shadow being cast and the mind adjusts to what you expect to see. Now we talk about bias, and those of you who heard me before will know that I don't like the term bias because bias sounds like a bad thing. And so sometimes we think, you know, I'm a good person, I don't have any bias. And even good people have bias. The way the unconscious mind works, it looks for shortcuts. And in looking for those shortcuts, it creates biases. It trips us up. And it's not something that just happens with bad people. It happens with all people. So the unconscious mind and conscious mind are oftentimes not in concert with each other. Now, this is a bias that I find particularly interesting. So if you look at this, you'll see that about 15% of men in the United States are over 6 feet. And yet, almost 60% of CEOs are over 6 feet. About 3% of men in the United States are over 6'2". I'm one of them. And almost 30% of the CEOs, 3% and almost 30% of the CEOs are over 6'2". If we went further, we'd say for over every inch you're over 6 feet, over your life, you're likely to make an additional $150,000. So Frank, congratulations. Now, how do we explain that? Is it really true that tall guys are just all that in a bag of chips? Are we really all that smart? I could believe it. But what social science tells us is that in our society, unconsciously, we have a height bias. And again, most of us are not aware of it. When we're interviewing people for jobs, we don't say, we think you have the job. Now just stand up and see how tall you are. It's yours, right? So this is happening not just in the context of race, this is happening all over. We have all kinds of biases where our mind reflects and acts on these biases without us consciously being aware of it. This is actually something for you to sort of go through, and Alexis did a great job on this today, go through and identify the words in color. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna clap, and I want you to read across when I tell you to, not before, so don't look at the screen right now, look at me. And each time I clap, I want you to move to the next word. But I don't want you to look at the word. What I'm asking you to identify is the color. In fact, I want you to ignore the word. Your job, your only job, is to identify the color and say it out loud at an even clip as I clap. Okay? You ready? Okay, look at the first one. All right? Okay.
It's because your green looks yellow and your black looks red.
Oh, yeah. So that's one explanation. But let me tell you another explanation. So there are different ways of showing. This is called the strobe test. And basically, when you're reading or when you're looking at the color, and the words are the same as the color, you can read it very fast. When you're looking at the color, and the word is different, it's hard to actually identify the color. Even though I ask you not to read the words, you can't turn it off. And this is something that we use to actually test what's happening at the unconscious level. You cannot turn the unconscious off. You can try. You can tell the unconscious, we don't want you to notice someone's race. We don't want you to notice someone's gender. If you're a good person, you're not going to notice whether or not someone has a disability. The unconscious says, y'all do what y'all want to do. We're noticing everything. And not only are we noticing it, we're acting on it, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So let me just see, how many of you see a shape up here? Raise your hand. Someone from the back, what's the shape that you see? A triangle, okay. How many people see a triangle? Okay, great. Now, at this point, it won't surprise you that no triangle is there. The white color is consistent throughout. So your unconscious mind expects to see a triangle, so you see a triangle. You made it up. It does not exist. Now, we process a lot of information. We process unconsciously, we process 11 million bits of information a second. 11 million bits. That's a lot of information. During that same second, we process 40 bits of information. 11 million versus 40. So the unconscious is doing a lot of work. The unconscious is doing most of the work, and it does it super fast. The conscious is doing very little work and is doing it really slow. And so if we can't actually process all the information we need to process in order to survive and do it consciously, the unconscious looks for shortcuts, is trying to process all this information, and to put it in clumps for it. It categorizes for us to make sense. Think about building a highway. And you build this highway to actually allow 40 cars a second or 40 cars a minute to pass. And now here comes 11 million cars a second. It would create a traffic jam that would last for decades. So the idea that we can make the unconscious mind ruly, that we could make it bend to our conscious minds, is actually a fallacy. In fact, there's some researchers who say the fallacy is the conscious mind. The conscious mind actually doesn't really exist. That stuff is done at the unconscious, it sends it upstairs, and the conscious thinks, wow, this just popped into my head from nowhere. So the process of othering is one of the things the unconscious mind does. And it's interesting, some people think that these categories, and particularly racial categories, is built into our brain system. We're hardwired to like those who look like us and to not like those as well who don't look like us. Turns out that's wrong. Categorization is built into our brain structure, but the existence of the categories, what they are and what they mean, is given to us by society. So race is there's nothing natural about race. We have constantly shifting different groups and different identities.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So let me explain to you what just happened. You can only process 40 bits of information a second consciously. Which 40 do you notice? There's something called priming that basically primes you to see certain things and therefore not to see other things. You actually saw the bear. Everybody saw the bear. And your unconscious mind actually processes it. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But your conscious mind, for most of you, did not. Your 40 bits of information was exhausted by the team in white and counting. Anything else now that comes across your tram, you don't consciously notice. So the unconscious does many things. It's actually sorts. It actually creates what's called neural networks or association, and it gives things meaning. So where does the unconscious learn? How does it actually decide that two things are related? The unconscious is deeply habituated. It's a habit machine. So when things happen frequently and in close proximity, it creates a relationship, even though there may not be a relationship. Frequency, and in close proximity. So you've heard of Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell, you feed the dog. You ring the bell, you feed the dog. You ring the bell, the dog starts salivating because the dog knows that there is a relationship between the bell and food. In fact, there is no relationship. We're all like Pavlov's dog. When things happen in close proximity and frequently, we create at an unconscious level a relationship between them. This is where stereotype comes from. This is where we create many what's called schemas, associations, and it's not possible to live without associations. It's not possible to actually process information just as it is. There's no such thing as processing information just as it is. Where do we get these associations from? These associations we get from society. We see 5,000 images a day, and many of those images we see in association with each other, and they create neural networks. They tell us these things, they tell the unconscious these things are related, even though cognitively, even though consciously, we may know they're not related. I mentioned the Harvard implicit association test. The tests in terms of our biases, our stereotypes, happen along many different categories. They happen along gender, they happen along race, they happen along age, they occur along our body size, whether we are native or not. Now, once these associations occur, these are social associations, which means they're happening throughout the entire society. So it turns out in our society, because of these images, we have negative association between blacks. We have an association between blacks and crime. We have an association between blacks and using drugs. Even though every researcher will tell you the drug use in the United States is distributed fairly evenly across the population, and in some cases there's a slightly higher drug use among whites. But that's not what the unconscious mind gets, because the unconscious mind doesn't care about statistics. It doesn't care about studies. It looks at the nightly news. It hears songs. It sees images. And the frequency in terms of blacks and crime or blacks and drugs is very high. This is what the unconscious is learning from. Now, once we create those phenomena in society, it's not just white people who are exposed to those phenomena. Black people are exposed to them too. So it turns out that blacks have bias against blacks as well as whites. It's not as high. That is, blacks' negative association of blacks is not as high as whites' negative association with blacks, in part because blacks have counterintuitive examples, counter-stereotypical examples. So if someone thinks blacks are violent because that's all I see on television, do you have any contact with a black man like my father, who's a real pacifist, who's a real sweetheart? So I may see these images on television, but I go home to my dad and I know that's not quite right. That story has to be more complicated. But because we live in segregated society, if you don't have contact with black men, or if you don't have contact with Muslims, or if you don't have contact with older people, your stereotypes are not challenged. One of the stereotypes are that blacks are more likely to be dangerous and have guns. Again, a stereotype that in fact is not only not accurate, blacks are least likely to have guns. I'm going to show you an image. I want you to see if you can recognize what the image is. So watch the screen. So there are two images, one at the bottom and one at the top. Let me show you one more time. All right, what were the images? Okay, let me show it to you in slow motion. Okay, and what were the images? Now, when I showed you the first image, you couldn't see because it was what's called subliminal. Your unconscious mind is fast, your conscious mind is slow. So you actually saw the image the first time in the unconscious. And what we've been able to do with that is show people images that are degraded and ask them how soon can they recognize what the image is. And what we are able to show is that when people see an image of a black face subliminally, that is, they can't consciously recognize it, they can more quickly identify a disfigured object as a gun, because there's an association at an unconscious level between blacks and gun. This goes back to the bear. So we see stuff at an unconscious level, and it affects us. It affects our behavior, it affects our judgment, even if we can't see it consciously. So I was at a talk earlier today, and I was saying, one of the people there was saying, but a lot of people I work say they're colorblind, that they don't see race. And again, it may be true that the conscious does not see race or does not want to see race, but the unconscious is not cooperative. It's not politically correct, it's not orderly, and it doesn't take orders from the conscious. So it's seeing, and we can measure that people are reacting. And in fact, when people try to be colorblind, it creates internal tension between what the unconscious mind is doing and the conscious mind, and cause something we call cognitive depletion. So when these things work together, they create networks and schemas, which helps us process the world. We need some way of processing all these information, and that's what the unconscious is doing. We cannot live without this information. The unconscious mind is fast. So if we see a stick or something in the grass, and we don't know what it is, we jump. We think it's a snake. It's not a snake. It's a stick. Oh, darn, I thought that was a snake. I'm so glad it was a stick. The next time we're walking through the forest, we see a stick. Only this time it's not a stick. It's a snake. And it bites us. And we die. This is a sad, sad story. But the story gets sadder. Now we die, we don't have offspring. So the person who is afraid survives and passes on their genes. The person who's deliberate, let me see, that could be a snake, that could be a stick. That person is not around. And the children are not around. So evolutionary, we've actually learned those who are more careful, those who are more fearful, evolutionarily, tend to survive and pass on those scary genes. So where do these schemas come from? Again, they're social. So when we talk about that we have biases and stereotypes and prejudice, we're not saying Frank is prejudiced. We're saying that Frank's unconscious mind is actually reading the environment. They're seeing things fire close together and frequently and drawing networks, drawing relationships. It's not just Frank that's doing it. Dr. Tatum is doing it. Mr. Blank is doing it. I'm doing it. This is the nature of the human mind. Now, the fact that we do it around race, it does not make us racist. But it will have racial implications. It will have consequences in terms of how we see things, how we evaluate people, who we hire. So it will affect us. And so part of the thing is to understand that this is happening and measure. We can now measure the unconscious. It's not the unconscious of Freud. It's not the unconscious that we put our dirty laundry and close the door. It's an unconscious that actually affects every aspect of our life. And there are things we can begin to do to actually affect it. Now, the way we organize society reinforce this. We have segregated neighborhoods, segregated schools, so we don't have counter-stereotypical experiences. And our social environment and our unconscious environment are constantly interacting with each other. They're reinforcing each other. We're talking about habits of the mind. And you know, habits are hard to break. Any of you have a habit and you say, I'm gonna stop doing that. Most of the time we're still doing it. And we go to a therapist and we go to get a patch and we go do and habits are just hard to break. Habits are shortcuts. Habits allows us to do things without thinking about them. That's what habits are. If you think about the first time you learned to drove, when you learned to drive, and it had not become habituated, it took tremendous psychological energy. I remember learning to drive when I was about 15 years old, and I wanted to learn to drive. I grew up in Detroit. Everybody wants to drive in Detroit. And my dad's taking me out, and I'm driving, and I'm so happy, I'm so proud. And my dad says, okay, John, you can go more than 15 miles an hour. And it's like, no, the world is rushing by too fast. And then finally he says, we can go on the freeway. And I said, oh, no. And now, because those functions have been largely assigned to the unconscious, I'm driving on the freeway, sometimes a little over the speed limit, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour. I'm listening to the radio. I'm talking on the phone. I'm eating food. That's because the unconscious is actually processing all this information. So it's actually a good thing, but sometimes it trips us up. So it's more than just a cognitive thing. The unconscious actually registers in the body, and we actually can recognize people having responses to us. Our body actually recognizes unconscious reactions. There's a story I tell. I went in the store. It wasn't Home Depot, though. It was a different store. And the sales clerk had her back turned to me. And so I walked up to her and said, "Excuse me." And she was maybe 5'3", and she turned around and she looked up and she said, "Can I help you?" And I felt like saying, "Yes, you can stand still." My guess is she was not aware that she was backing up. Her body was reacting. Her body was reacting to a tall black man standing in front of her, and she was backing away. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't feel like it would have been a helpful conversation. So there's a strong connection between individuals and society. And this is counterintuitive. Our unconscious is social. Our conscious is individual. When we're talking about the unconscious, we're talking about what we actually share in groups together. We're not talking about individuals. We're talking about what we share. And that's important in terms of how we might make these changes as well. The unconscious also helps us retain information. And it actually helps us perceive. It helps us make meaning. It's doing a lot of good stuff. So it's not just what we see. It helps us interpret the meaning of what we see. It helps us interpret, is this dangerous? Is this not dangerous? That's all learned. So oftentimes when we actually interact with each other, we prefer to think that we're logical. We prefer to think that we're in control. And it turns out the conscious mind is, but the conscious mind is small. And in fact, research has shown a person who's really sure they're being objective, they don't have any bias, is probably the person who has the most bias and the most difficult to change. They're out of touch with their unconscious, and they're probably out of touch with their body. So it's like, oh no, I never have a negative thought about anybody. Well, you're trying to lock the basement door, but there's a whole party going on downstairs. And if we are attuned, we can't know everything that's going on, but we can know some things that's going on. So we've already seen that the conscious can affect what we see, how we understand the world. It affects structures, the structures that we build. I'm going to have you do one other quick little experiment. I want you to, if you have on glasses, take them off. And I'm going to have you do something like this. You're going to cover one eye, and you're going to look straight ahead, and you take your hand and go like this. Okay, that's the end of the experiment. You all passed. So how many of you saw your hand continuously move back and forth before your eyes as you did that experiment? Sure. Raise your hands. Okay. Now, actually, you didn't. You all know you have a blind spot. The blind spot is huge. When you go to the optometrist, they have this little dot, and they say, follow the dot. And all of a sudden, the dot disappears. Where'd it go? Into the blind spot. Then it comes back. But when we are waving our hands or in our everyday life, we don't notice the blind spot because the unconscious fills it in. We see stuff that's actually not there to be seen. When it's in the blind spot, we should see a hole in our vision if we close one eye. But we don't see the hole. Even though we know the hole is there, the unconscious still tricks us into thinking, there's no hole there. I'm seeing everything there is to be seen. So the unconscious bias affects our behavior. Now, we already had one experiment with priming, but let me just tell you a little bit more about priming. Priming, that is activating identities and stuff unconsciously, affects the way we engage the world. And one of the things that's done around priming is something called stereotype threat. So this is an experiment that's been done in now hundreds of times. And so there are many variations of this. Stereotype threats can happen to everyone. Stereotype threats is basically when there's some part of your identity that's salient, that's actually exposed to a threat from society. So let me give you a more concrete example, and I'll give you a couple. But it's also something very positive about this priming. So Claude Steele, who actually coined the phrase, he was teaching at Stanford, PhD candidates in math, and he had a group of women who were mainly Asian American women, and this is what he did. He said, I love teaching here at Stanford, in part because they have so many smart women. And then 15 minutes later, he gave them a math test. And they did very poorly on the test. So a second group of women came in from the same pool that had exactly the same math ability. This time what Claude said is, I love teaching here at Stanford because there's so many smart Asian American women. He gave them the same test and they aced it. The first group failed it, the second group aced it. They had exactly the same ability. What's going on? How do we explain that? What's going on is that Claude is priming them, and in priming them, he's calling an identity forward. He's making one identity more salient. The first identity, he makes their womanness salient. And they are aware, like most of us, that women are not supposed to be good at math. And so once they start acting from that, there's a threat, because their identity of womanness and the threat that women can't do math affects their ability to do math, and they don't do well. The second time, he activates their Asian Americanness. And we know that Asian Americans are supposed to be good at math. And so they perform great at math. Now, in case you think this is just about Asian American women, just to give you one other example, Claude does a similar thing with golf. But this time he does, his groups are white men and black men. The first prime. You know, golf is not a game about strength and how tough you are. It's really a mental game. It's mental strategy, attention, acuity. So go play some golf, have fun. Now the white guys are just killing the course, and they do extremely well. The black guys are struggling. From the same pool, he brings the second group of men with exactly the same ability in golf. This time he says, you know, people overthink golf. Golf is all about rhythm, about how you feel in your body, about being comfortable, about getting in the flow. Now the black guys are just killing the game. And the white guys are struggling. He's activated stereotypes. And we do this all the time, 100 times a day. So in terms of the school context, we know, for example, if you have black children or Latino children take a standardized test, but before you give them the test, you ask them to check their race. You just depress their performance, because they are aware, unconsciously, that blacks and Latinos are not supposed to be good at a standardized test. And if you make that salient and then give them a standardized test, they don't perform well. And what you see before you is that we've been able to manipulate the identities to close the achievement gaps between blacks and whites as much as 50%, just by priming them, telling who's going to show up to take the test. Now, some of us find this amazing. You know, football players don't find it amazing. Basketball players don't, you know, they're priming each other all the time. We call it talking trash. Oh yeah, you're gonna miss that shot. Go ahead, try. But the whole idea is to get in somebody's head. But our society is constantly sending messages to threaten people, to tell people they don't belong, and it affects how they actually perform. This is something called the social cognition test done by Susan Fisk from Princeton. And what she does is two axes. How much do you like someone, and how smart do you think you are? And she did a national test. Turns out, if you like someone and you think they're smart, that's the gold standard. And so who do we like as a society and think they're smart? Tends to be white men. We tend, as a society, we like white men, and we think they're pretty smart. There's another group, we think they're smart. We actually don't like them all that much. Tends to be Asian and Asian Americans. Like, yeah, they can do math, but they can't dance. And then there's another group, we like them, but we don't think they're very smart. Tends to be people with disabilities, tends to be women, tends to be the elderly. My Uncle Joe, really nice guy, but I don't want to get behind him in line. He's just not that. He's not all that. He doesn't have Alzheimer's yet. And then there's a group that we don't like them, and we don't think they're very smart. That tends to be young black men, tends to be immigrants, tends to be homeless people. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is that when we don't like someone and we don't think they're smart, when we see another human being, nature thought it would be a good thing for us to recognize each other. So when we see another human being, there's a part of the brain that lights up. Fellow species. Hey, fellow species, how you doing? No snakes today, good. When we see homeless people, that part of the brain does not light up. Literally, at an unconscious level, there are groups of people that we don't see as human. And when we don't see people as human, bad things happen to those groups of people. We can't adopt policies, even if the policies are going to save money. So part of the thing this is the unconscious actually saying there's certain people who are not people. And we know, whether it's with police and young black men, oftentimes literally they do not see black men as people. And again, it's not because they're racist. It's because of all these social cues that they're given. I want to talk a little bit about anxiety and then close out shortly. So anxiety is slightly different than implicit bias. We've been talking mainly about implicit bias. And there are different kinds of anxiety. There's anxiety of confirming someone's stereotype. So oftentimes in interracial interactions, whites actually experience anxiety that they're going to confirm blacks concerned that they're racist. So it makes them a little uptight because we don't want to be racist. But there's another anxiety, and that is the anxiety that we already talked about in terms of the country is changing. I'm losing my country. Now, most of us, or many of us, when we say we're losing our country, we're not simply talking about our country, we're talking about ourselves. So really what we're saying is, I am losing my identity. All these black people, all these Latinos, what's happening to America? What happened to the America I grew up in? Women running for president? What is this about? That's not the America I knew. And so we can show and we can measure people having growing anxiety. And anxiety is about who belongs. And sometimes we feel like we as a group belong. Sometimes we feel like we as a group do not belong. African Americans have had a long history of not belonging. Native Americans have had a long history of not belonging. When we segregate a people, we're saying to those people, you don't belong. Literally, I remember being a kid and running or walking into a white neighborhood and the police stopping me. And they didn't ask me, was I committing a crime? It's like, what are you doing in this neighborhood? They're saying, you do not belong. They're sending a message. And so what's happening, there's been recent study that most Americans, black, white, Latino, Asian, rich and poor, have a sense that they do not belong. We're feeling, as a country, we're feeling that none of us really belong. The country's being taken away from us, and we're pointing to each other. It's taken away from me because of you. No, it's taken away because, The point is, it creates tremendous anxiety. And this anxiety is being exploited. And I think one way of understanding what's happening in the country is this extreme othering that's going And we need a different discourse. We need a discourse that actually helps us, not just consciously, but unconsciously see each other as people. And that's something that largely is not happening. How do we do this? There are a number of mechanisms. Part of it is social contact, for people to just have contact with each other. A lot of this comes from the environment, so we can send different environmental cues. We can send different messages. We could, as educators, not only have black and white kids in the lunchroom together, Dr. Tatum, we could actually have them sit together. We could do things to bring people together. Now you may think, well, it's too hard, we can't do that. The reality is Americans trying to do that. But leadership matters. We're not exercising leadership in this area. So what are the incentives to affirmatively say everybody belongs? How we structure our systems, how we structure our schools, how we structure our neighborhoods, how we structure housing, all of this says to people, who's in a movie? A quick story about this. 20 years ago, I'm sitting in front of a television watching a movie with my daughter, and it's a bad horror movie, and there's a monster in the closet. And there's a young blonde walking around the house by herself, and she's ordered some pizza, and she goes to open the closet, and my daughter winces. And I said, don't worry, nothing's going to happen to her. And then there's a knock on the door, and she doesn't open the closet, she goes to open the front door. And there's a Latino serving pizza. And she buys the pizza, and then she goes away. The monster comes out of the closet and eats the Latino guy and leaves. And my daughter said, how did you know that? Did you see that movie before? And I said, as a matter of speaking, I've seen that movie many times. Where it's only recently that blacks have been able to live throughout the whole movie. They're always there to feed the monster. So these images matter to the unconscious. We may think they're just pictures, but they're not. The unconscious is actually, they're messages we're giving our kids. We're saying, you know, what are black people good for? They're good monster food. There was a study done at UT Austin. And basically, they had a number of students, black and Latino, who were not performing well. And Texas spent millions of dollars trying to help these kids get up to speed. Hard school, great school, and they had very little movement in their performance. And the narrative was, these kids are just not smart enough to be at UT Austin. It's a hard school. And finally, a professor brought them together and said, how does it feel being at UT Austin? And the students let out this torrent of information. It's a terrible place. I feel so isolated. I feel alone. No one understands me. No one talks to me. No one. And through that conversation, the students start performing extremely well. It wasn't because they weren't performing because of lack of capacity. They were not performing because they didn't feel like they belonged. Now, what was Texas doing to make them feel like they didn't belong? A lot of things, the curriculum, the teachers. I was recruited to teach at UT Austin. And it's a great school. Frank came from there, and I went to Berkeley, but he was in Austin, and I went there. And I thought, this is a great town, great school, and they're showing me around. And in the midst of showing me around, they say, there's a lot of Confederate memorabilia, Professor Powell, but don't let that put you off. We're part of the South. We're fighting for the Civil War, or the War of Aggression, as they like to say. I said, okay, whatever you say. I'm going to Berkeley. But think of young kids going around the school where all of the icons, all of the pictures, all the images about people fighting to keep them enslaved. So it wasn't until someone dealt with the issue of belonging that the students start performing. So we're dealing with implicit bias and stereotype threat. And we talk about how this microaggression leaks out into our behavior, how we read it, and sometimes we don't even know. Did that person not speak to me because I'm black? Did that person not speak to me because they don't like to speak to people? We don't know. But we do know this. For people to thrive, they need connectivity. They need to be part of networks. They need to be part of the right networks. They need to be part of networks that as a ladder to opportunity. I'll tell you one last story and then I'll close. I did a project in Cleveland, and I was working with black businesses, and I know that you're concerned about being more inclusive. And what we found is that black businesses and white businesses in Cleveland grew at the same rate for about 6 years. And after that, the white businesses took off and the black businesses stalled. And they brought me there and asked me to look at the problem and help them try to solve it. And so I was there, and I was meeting with some of the black business leaders, and they were saying, we actually don't want you here. We know what the problem is. It's racism, it's discrimination. So why are we paying some professor to come study us, to study the obvious? And I said, you're probably right, but since I'm here, why don't you humor me? Because I am getting paid. And so they did, they humored me. And what we found was, in order to grow past 6 years, you didn't need to take out a loan. You needed equity investment. You needed investors. And the way the white businesses got investors is they wouldn't talk to their uncle or their brother or their friend and say, I have a thriving business, but I'm stuck. You want to invest $150,000 into the business. And they did, and they grew. They had a connection. They had a network that helped them grow. And the black businesses, it's like they went and talked to their cousin, and they said, I have $150,000, and they said, where are you going to get that? Because the black community didn't have any wealth. And so what Cleveland did is they created an equity fund for black investors, for black businesses. Those businesses started growing. That was 15 years ago. That equity fund is still in place because people repay it, but it was the lack of a network. Networks matter. The right networks matter. It matters in terms of violence. It matters in terms of health. It matters in terms of businesses. The CDC has done work on this in terms of understanding sexually transmitted disease. So networks matter. So as you look at this stuff, implicit bias, you look at this stuff, stereotype threats, you also need to look at the networks that different populations have. And the networks, unfortunately, in our society tend to be deeply racialized. And if you need more of this or want more of this afterwards, there are going to be, I think, 2 books for sale, one by Dr. Tatum and one by John Powell. So thank you.
Well, I want to begin by just thanking you for your great presentation, and I know that I speak for the audience to say it was really engaging, very interesting, and I want to pose a question, but let me just say that as was mentioned at the beginning, you've got cards. If you have questions, you should have made note of them and make those cards available to someone who will collect them, and we will be able to have a little time, we hope, to at least address a few of those questions that you all have generated. But I've got a question, and I'm going to start with that because, you know, when we talk about implicit bias, and you were really clear about the fact that you can't avoid it, right? As wonderful a person as someone might be, we all have biases. Right. I like to say it's like breathing smog. You know, we're all smog breathers, whether we want to be or not. So we all have it in that sense, but I'm wondering whether you find when you give these talks, people say, okay, well then I don't have to do anything. Right. It's unavoidable. I guess I'll just go home and be my discriminatory self.
Right, right. And that's true. That's a very serious issue, and it's a question that comes up a lot. A number of my African-American friends say, you got to stop saying this because you're letting white people off the hook. You're saying they're not responsible for their biases. And that's not what I'm saying at all. Mm-hmm. First of all, the things we can do and the things we should do, it's actually easier or more appropriate to do things collectively. It's like climate change, for those of you who engage in the belief of climate change. It's like it's happening, and it may not be anything I can do by myself, but collectively we can do something. So what are some of the strategies to actually address implicit bias? One of them, of course, is actually being in relationship with others and doing it where others are in relationship in a critical mass. We can do audits of physical space. There's a concept called ambience belonging, which is basically saying, does the environment tell you you belong or not? A couple of examples. Think of someone in a wheelchair. They come up and there's no ramp for them to get up into the building. it's not simply they can't get in the building. We've actually sent a message to them that says, you don't belong here. Think of someone who's Jewish, and they come into a building, and there's a giant big cross, or there's a giant, all these things are symbols. Think of a dollar bill. Think of this. We, for 200 years, have had currency, although national currency, really only since the Civil War. Every dollar bill has a picture of a man. So for 200 years, you're constantly spending and being reminded, yes, indeed, this is a man's world. Now, I'm not saying the people who built the building and didn't build a ramp were hostile to people with disabilities, but once we become aware of it, then we're responsible. When we don't know it, we can't do anything about it. But once someone says, you know what, this ramp is not accessible, it's like, oh my God, I didn't think of that. But now you've clued me in. Let me do something. So once we know that having students check a box about race before they take a test is likely to produce negative outcomes, we become responsible. So the knowledge that you have about how these things work makes you responsible both individually and collectively.
So one of the things that you said, and I'm thinking about this accountability issue, but when you were speaking, you said something at the very beginning which I would like to hear you elaborate on, and that has to do with this idea that the categories are not fixed categories. You know, we know that we do categorize, right? We need to, as you said, to make sense of the world, the brain is always looking for shortcuts. And we live in a race-conscious society where the categories are often defined in terms of race or ethnicity. But as you know, and I imagine others in the room know, those categories haven't always been defined in the same ways today, as in the past as they are today. But can you talk a little bit more about how we move beyond those categories and what the role of leadership is relative to that?
Well, these things are hard, and change is hard, and leadership matters a lot. And in fact, I would say part of what you're seeing now in the political, I know it's not a political talk, but part of what you're seeing in terms of politics is not simply trading on people's anxiety. We're giving people permission to actually explore certain things. It's sort of interesting. You think about gays and transgendered populations. I would venture to guess that it's not simply people coming out of the closet. We're actually giving people permission to experiment with different identities, and then people experiment. And so we can create categories that are fluid. We can make it not costly to cross boundaries, or we can make it extremely costly. You think about something like a caste system. A caste system says, we've organized these categories, and you can never leave your category. Now, or we could say, yes, you have a category, but those categories are constantly being remade, rethought, and you get to participate in the remaking of those categories. Now that's challenging because we are in relationships, so if I change my categories, it affects how you do your categories. I remind people, for example, many people in the audience are a different age range. In the 1930s, most people who are today called white would not be called white. White was not the salient racial identity. You were Italian American, you were German American, you were Polish American, and your families lived in Polish American neighborhoods. You went to Polish American churches. You had Polish American newspapers. You had Polish American schools. And that's the way things were. And then something happened. All of a sudden, we got the suburbs, and Polish Americans became white Americans. German Americans became white Americans. The people who study intermarriage, and to study Polish Americans marrying only Polish Americans is anathema now, because Polish Americans marry any other white Americans, and ethnicity has gone in the background. I grew up, born in the 1940s. I was born colored. By the time the late 50s, I had turned into a Negro. By the mid-60s, I was African American. Then I was Afro, and then I was black. Now, what I'm suggesting, now think about this. Now many white people call themselves European Americans, that we are constantly doing this dance of redoing our identities. And actually, we're doing that right now. And there's something I do sometime, and I want to do it here. Just it takes 30 seconds. In 2010, 15% of the marriages in the United States was between people of a different race or ethnicity, which is kind of amazing. The projection is that in the next 15 to 20 years, that number will hit 25%. It will be larger than the Black and Latino community combined, and it's growing very fast. 40% of families have someone in the family of a different race or ethnicity, 40%. And in 15 years, it will be 60%. People are creating new identities, but they're not talking about it. So here's what I want to do. If any of those statistics describe you or your family and you're not too shy, raise your hand. This is a new, so we're making new categories all the time. We haven't created a language to talk about it. And I talk to some of my gay and lesbian friends, and I say, who actually have similar experience, and I say, you've come out once. You need to come out a second time and talk about your inter-ethnic and interracial family. Because they say it's hard to hate people you love. But we haven't had this conversation. And every place I go, the majority of people raise their hand, and yet nobody's talking about it. So these categories, and yet there's some people who are afraid. We're making new categories. Ooh, that's not good.
Yeah. But even as we make new categories, one of the things that you said is that even when you belong to a particular category, you can still have bias about that category.
That's exactly right.
That we're still exposed to, as I like to say, we're exposed to misinformation about people different from ourselves. We're also exposed to misinformation about people like ourselves.
That's exactly right.
And so that we're always internalizing these negative messages. And so even though the categories change, it is possible that the unconscious mind is still stuck in the past.
It is. The unconscious, this interesting thing about the brain is constantly learning. I mean, it's a fascinating machine. It may not even be a machine. Do two quick things. So what is, I think it's 10 to the 28th power. I'll give you a couple of numbers. 10 to the 10th power and 10 to the 28th power. What do those two numbers represent?
Big numbers.
Big numbers, that's right, the big numbers. So 10 to the, I think, and I have to check on this, 10 to the 10th power is the number of atoms in the universe. 10 to the 28th power is the number of connections the brain is capable of making.
Wow.
The brain, I mean, we're not even scratching the surface. So part of it is that we're learning stuff. And the unconscious actually can be taught, and it's constantly interacting with the environment. And so part of it is like we can participate in this wonderful process that we don't know the end of. But we do know we're not just wired to actually make categories, we're also wired to connect with each other. They call it mirror neurons. We actually are wired to, one could even say, love each other. And whether that happens or not depends on leadership, depends on opportunity, depends on the environment, depends on whether we accentuate the things that we're afraid of each other or start to actually do things that connect each other. Last example, the Dalai Lama has an experiment with a homeless person, and they're talking to someone, they're interviewing someone with a medical doctor, and they says, that's a homeless person. Tell me what you think. And the brain, to recognize another human being, is completely quiet. And then they says, what kind of vegetables do you think that person likes? The part of the brain lights up. Just to have to think of this homeless person eating vegetables, all of a sudden they become human. So if we tell good stories actually humanize us. It allows us to have empathy toward each other. And I've been pushing Zootopia as one of those good stories for kids to sort of create new categories. It doesn't mean we'll be category free. It doesn't mean the world will be perfect, but it may move us in the right direction.
As I listen to you, I'm thinking, of course, if we could move in that direction and if we had leaders who were drawing the circle very inclusively so that we would all start to see each other truly as human, that would be a tremendous plus. But at the same, and, that's not a but, and we know that there's a lot that we need to do. There's a lot of work to be done before we get to that place. And I think about the implications of this mind science that you have shared with this audience and its implications for education.
That's right.
And I was looking at the series that the Perception Institute is putting out. And for those of you who don't know, the Perception Institute has what I think is going to be a wonderful source of information, a series called The Science of Equality. And one of the papers in that series, I read this quote, I just want to read it. It says, "We live in a time when discrimination looks less like a segregated lunch counter and more like a teacher never calling on your son." And there are two things that made me think of. One was my own experience when I used to we lived in Massachusetts before coming to Georgia, and when my children were small, I used to take them to the Science Museum in Cambridge, beautiful, wonderful museum of science, and they would have these programs, for kids, and my children were especially interested in science, and there would always be a call for a volunteer. And now we're putting ourselves in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a diverse community, but still majority white. And my oldest son would always be waving his hand to be called on and would never get called on. And it was so heartbreaking to see him put his hand down and never be called on. So I thought of that when I read this quote. But when you think about how we can use this understanding, this new mind science, to improve the experiences of kids in schools.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And I want to challenge all of us, because part of what we think about, and there's a whole other set of lectures I give about structures, and structures are never neutral. Structures are doing some work. Structures are habits themselves. You drove here, you follow the roads, you don't cut across the fields. What we think about oftentimes as we sort of continue this journey as human beings, we think about removing discrimination. Mm-hmm. That's too narrow. Structures don't just discriminate, they also enhance. And so we need to think about, how do we create structures to celebrate, to make us all fully belong? Now, how do we know we don't all fully belong? When you see large group disparities are not the same as individual disparities. So Frank might be smarter than me. He's certainly taller than me, so Mr. Blank, I hope he's making more money than me. But if we say all one people, that is, men are smarter than women, or blacks are smarter than Latinos, or white, that's a problem. So when we see these large disparities, it says something's probably not right. Mm-hmm. We should need to investigate that much more deeply. So how do we affirmatively use structures and stories to make sure everybody's there? How do we actually create a circle of human concern when no one's outside of it? And these disparities tell us we probably are not there. So how do we affirmatively say, we're not hoping people come together, like with children, because kids left to their own devices wouldn't go to school. Mm-hmm. We say you gotta go to school, you gotta learn. But what we need to learn most is how to relate to each other. So when Dr. King talked about a beloved community, he was talking about an ideal. And it was an ideal that we actually embraced for a while. And you're right, what the leaders do right now is they trade on people's fear, and they use that for political gain. We have to give people an alternative. So as people are afraid and anxious, what's a positive vision? What might we do? The last thing I'll say is that clearly, one of the things that happened in the height of the civil rights movement is that the segregationists said we can't have integrated schools, because if we have integrated schools, white and black children going to school together might marry each other, and some of them will even have sex. And what the civil rights movement's response was, this is not about dating, this is not about marriage, this is about education. Don't worry. Both of them were wrong. Because as we see, yes, if you put people together and they have an experience together, they will start to create new boundaries. Someone will create babies. And so the fear that the segregationists had was actually a well-received fear, except they thought if black and whites marry and have babies, something terrible is going to happen to the country. Like what? And so part of it is to actually step into this anxiety, help people negotiate it, and leaders and institutions play a huge role. So again, not to just say, let's not discriminate, let's affirmatively find more about the unconscious. Let's actually structure schools so kids do have real experiences. Let's think about neighborhoods so people actually meet each other as equals. Let's think about when we structure something, we think about who decides, is it inclusive? Who pays and who benefits? And if it's one race, one group, one religion, one gender, it's problematic.
I know that we have some leaders in the audience, and one of those leaders is Dr. Maria Kostarfin, the superintendent of the Atlanta Public Schools, and I know that she has a question.
Why, thank you. No pressure. Dr. Powell, it's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well.
Welcome to Atlanta. So I'm thinking back on your slide about those categories that are considered despised. I have a school district that basically meets almost all of those descriptors. I have homeless kids, I have children who are undocumented, I have Black boys, I have, just like I said, just about every group. So you talked before that about the power of priming, and I've done a dissertation, and I know I want to be careful about things like human subject consent and things of that sort, so I don't want to do anything creepy. But what can we do to leverage the power of priming for those groups that are most subconsciously despised by most of us?
I think that's a very important question, especially for an educator. Dr. Tatum talked about kids not being called on. They get the message, and the teachers aren't necessarily deliberately not calling. They've been primed not to notice the hands of a Black kid. Yeah. They've been primed to actually see a Black kid getting in trouble. Even when a white kid is doing the same thing, we don't see it. So all of this is actually affecting both the teachers and the students. And we know it when we look at the data, right? When we see Black kids and white kids, similar behavior. In San Francisco, a very liberal city, Blacks are 11 times more likely to be suspended from school as white kids. It's not explained in terms of behavior. So part of it is making this data available, but part of it's also helping the students make sense of it and belong. And we know in terms of stories, in terms of teachers, in terms of possibility. And there's some complexity, right? Because one of the things, if you just lay out some of the negative aspects of it, even though it's true, you may depress students even more. Say, you got to be careful because if you go outside, you might get shot by a gang or you might get shot by police. That's kind of depressing. I was hoping to go play marbles. And so I think some of the things we can do, when I talked about tests, we can do audits, like literally go into a room. We've done this in terms of, if you look at tech pictures, the typical tech pictures are male and they're science fiction. And that depresses women's sense and white or Asian. That depresses women's sense and people of color sense that this is not their place. I work with Apple on some of these things. And they say they want people in, but they create an environment that says you don't belong. Or they bring in one person. So we know if people come into schools and higher ed and posses and networks, they actually perform much better because they have friends that they can talk to be able to talk about this stuff, to help students navigate it, even as we change the structures themselves. So it's a long-term thing, but I think the first thing is recognizing that there's a problem and we can do something about it, and then to figure out what to do about it. And it is tricky because we work with a lot of school districts and some of the teachers sometimes get nervous. It's like, you're doing all these testing, are you saying I'm biased? So everybody's biased, but we're not saying you're racist, and that's actually quite different.
I know that there is also a group of students here from Spelman College. I believe we have some Spelman students here, and I want to give an opportunity for a young person to ask a question. So if we've got a Spelmanite ready to ask a question, I'd love to hear one. Oh, and here we do. Yes.
My question is, how do we alleviate the issue of minority children being primed in ways that may place them in the pipeline to prison?
How we got to what a friend of mine, Michelle Alexander, called the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration, was not simply, we didn't stumble on it. The leaders of the country figured this out as a strategy. And we now have historical records where they acknowledge this. It's like, okay, we're going to criminalize hippies and blacks. We're going to criminalize hippies using marijuana. We'll criminalize blacks using heroin. They were conscious of this. When they first started this, sort of around the edges with Reagan, with Nixon, really strong-hearted with Reagan, and continued on by Clinton. And some of them, including Bill Clinton, said, okay, maybe I made a mistake. In some sense, they knew they were pandering to white anxiety. They knew they were pandering to white stereotypes, and they were using it for political gain. And so part of it is telling that story, As you know, heroin is coming back as a major epidemic, but instead of seeing it as a criminal justice issue, because it's now affecting the white community, we're defining it as a health issue, which it clearly is. Health issue, but the one question is, why are whites starting to use heroin so profusely? And it's largely because they feel alienated, they feel a sense of hopeless, they feel angry, they feel, so I think part of it is telling a different story. I think part of it is actually making different policies. And then the things we do in the schools. There's a question, for example, of safety in the schools. But we know if we put uniformed police in schools, we've just depressed the educational outcomes of the students. You've sent a message to the students that this is not a school, this is a detention center. So we know the kids have to be safe, but there are things we can do that also say, this is a place where we care about you, where we're going to take care of you, and they're learners. So they're very concrete things that we can do to start changing this. There are some studies on this. I mean, one of the things is to remind students of their connection with the community. I'll give you another concrete example. So this is actually in higher ed. Black students in college, and this is sort of one of those disturbing truths, inconvenient truths. Black students in college today don't do as well as black students in college in the late 60s and early 70s, which is counterintuitive because they're better prepared academically. The black students in the 60s and 70s were not well prepared academically. And they went to colleges, and yet they did better than the black students today. And so I talked to some social psychologists like, what's going on? These kids, many of them have gone to great schools, they're more likely to be middle class. Why aren't they doing better? They're not connected. The black students that went to school in the 60s and 70s were connected to their community. So part of the thing is to connect kids with each other. And so one of the primes we do is to have kids write something about why is it important to your community that you do well in school? That actually turns out to be an incredibly powerful prime. So it's reminding the kid that you're doing something. How many of you saw the movie, what is it, I think A Kill of the Bee?
Yes, yeah.
A great example. Her learning, it's too bad how they treated the Asian, I thought that was a negative stereotype, but her learning was something that was a community project. The whole community was invested, and she was invested in the community. So to remind kids, not just in words, but also in deeds and action, that you are part of this community. We care about you. You're a community resource, and we're going to take care of you.
We've got some questions from the audience, and I don't know how many we'll be able to get to, but this one I think is a very important one, and it speaks to one of your points about racial anxiety. So I just want to read the question. Since Georgia has such gross disparities, black, brown, poor, disabled, as examples, how to address structural barriers that are racially, ethnically derived when leaders don't want to talk about race? How can we address these issues if we can't have the conversation?
If you can't have the conversation, you can't address the issues.
Yeah.
But you can have the conversation. The way we talk about race in this country is actually incredibly inartful. We don't talk about it in a very mindful way. We talk about it in a very clumsy way. We talk about it in a very stale way. So the conversation oftentimes is like this, you know, from the white perspective, especially quote unquote white conservatives, like black people need to have more personal responsibility. They have a culture of poverty. They don't try hard enough. If they stop having babies, blah, 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 stop, pull up their pants, da, 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 and on and on and on. And from the black's perspective, it's often white people are just racist. They're dealing in white supremacy. And so you have a conversation where both sides are, kernels of truth, but a lot of attacking each other. And for people of goodwill to realize that a lot of these things happen not because of someone's lack of personal initiative, or not even because of traditional old forms of explicit racism, and that we can do something about it. So when we talk about race, and this is why the mind science is so important to say, this is something that affects all of us. This is about the future of America. If America is going to be a great country, there's a book called The Race Between Technology and Education. And it writes about how the United States became the dominant economic power in the world at the beginning of the 20th century. And what the writers say, they're two economists, what they say is that the United States was the first major country to educate women. Mm-hmm. It didn't do it well, and women weren't treated well, but they started educating women. Every other country was playing with half a deck. And today, people of color are in the same position as women. Half the country, half the children in the country are people of color. We're talking about the future of the country. We're talking about getting to know each other. We're talking about having relationships with each other. And we can do bad things and be good people. So part of it is to acknowledge that we all have a stake in this. There's a book called Other People's Children, a very unfortunate title. There's no such thing as other people's children. These are our children. We need to claim them, and we make some mistakes. We made a lot of mistakes. It doesn't mean you don't love the country to say we took the land from Native Americans. It doesn't mean that you're a racist if you say, okay, yes, you need to show up at school. So I think that we have to create, those of us who are in the room, those of us who care, and the leaders have to actually exemplify we can have this conversation, and we're going to create a space where we walk this together, where our faiths are linked. Dr. King did this 30, 40 years ago, and we know a lot more since he died, but we're not using it.
There's a question that is asking about racism specifically, and when we talk about, you've talked about the unconscious bias and the behaviors that flow from that as not being explicitly racist, or the motive is not necessarily to be discriminatory, but sometimes the outcome is. And so when do we use the R word? The person is asking the question, when is it racism? And I am wondering, I'm answering the question for you, but I know that sometimes people mean different things when they say the word racism. When I use the word racism, I'm talking about systems of advantage based on race, that are systematically advantaging one group over another, and it's not necessarily about particular individuals as much as it is about systems that advantage or disadvantage groups. But when you're thinking about this, the behaviors that flow from unconscious bias, sometimes conscious, but often unconscious, when, if ever, do you call it racism?
Well, I think we're seeing racism in the campaign. There's a friend of mine wrote a book called Dog Whistle Politics.
Yes.
And he chronicles how the elites decided to use symbolic racial stereotypes to actually restructure the economy. Not because they were racist, but because it gave them more power. And I've written something recently, what I call From Dog Whistle to Bullhorn. We're not using dog whistles anymore. When you have a dog whistle, you blow it. We don't hear it. Humans don't hear it, the dogs do. And what he was saying is that people use symbols and words to actually activate certain populations. Those words, but they had to be subtle. They had to be deniable. This is not about race. This is about food stamps. This is not about race. This is about welfare. This is not about race. It was always about race. So I don't know if that's racism. Also, I think we actually don't really understand the role of race in our society. And I think we have to have that discussion. I'll give you two examples. How many of you know that slavery in the United States ended in 1945? Okay, not many. So, how many of you know that slavery never ended in the United States? All right. Now, small thing, 13th Amendment, which is the amendment supposed to end slavery. If you read it, go and read it tonight, it says involuntary servitude shall be unlawful in the United States, except, we don't pay attention to the except. And what the except was when someone's duly convicted for a crime, which leads to mass incarceration, which leads back to slavery. So just interesting. So my point is we don't really know our history. But the other thing, right now, people are getting really exercised about how we pick delegates. Most people don't realize that we have 50 states with almost unlimited power in terms of how they pick delegates. What that flows from is the 3/5 rule in the Constitution, which was creating the electoral college to elect the president. We actually don't directly vote for the president. We vote for electors. And Donald Trump is saying, that's not fair. Well, if it wasn't fair for Donald Trump, was it fair for all the blacks in Mississippi for the last 100 years? I mean, it's sort of interesting that he's discovered the Electoral College and thinks, it's not fair, okay? Okay. I might agree with him, but it didn't just become unfair. We have a process that most people are not aware of. So when someone's intentionally engaging in racialized things, I would call it racism. But I say there are a lot of processes, a lot of designs in our structure that are profoundly racializing, profoundly complex, that not only hurt blacks, but also hurt Latinos, also hurt Native Americans, also hurt Muslims, and also hurt whites. That our racialized system actually is a system that affects us all. And when we talk about white supremacy, which I think is an ideology, not a reality, whites as a group have never been supreme in the United States. Never. When race was created, there were 3 tiers. And whites was the middle tier, and the non-whites was the bottom tier, and the elites was the top tier, and they did not consider themselves white. And so when we have this discussion, I think we have to bring the elites back into the discussion. It's not just between people of a different phenotype. It's like, what are the elites up to today? The country, and I'll stop after this, the economy has grown by almost 3 times since 1970. Where's all that money gone? It has not gone to white men. It has not gone to white women. It certainly hasn't gone to blacks, Latinos, Indians, Native Americans. Where has it gone? Oh, to the elites. How did we do that? We did that by racializing and trading on racial resentment to restructure the economy. So there's some big issues at play. And at the same time, we have to think about the line of schools, we have to think about housing, we have to think about the stadium, we have to think about how we organize our space. And so these are complex issues. And I think, from my perspective, racism actually stops us from thinking.
Yeah.
We think we understand it. And that's why I made the phrase that race is like gravity. Like everybody understands, how much do you weigh? I weigh 180 pounds, right? So how does that relate to gravity? I have no idea. By some accounts, there are 12 people in the world that really understand gravity. And I would say there are probably not many more people that really understand the complex dynamics of race and racism. It may be 12, it's not the same 12. But we need to study. We're actually talking about really complex systems. But more importantly, we're talking about a future we can imagine where we all belong.
That's a great place for us to stop, imagining that future. Thank you so much.